Hi everyone, I wanted to talk to you about the role of women in the turn of the century from 1890 to about 1920, which is when Charlotte Perkins Gilman wrote her short story, The Yellow Wallpaper. So I wanted to give you some context to understand what's happening in that story and what was happening in the U.S. at about the time she was writing. So 1890 to 1920 is considered the progressive era in America. And if you think about how things were changing and how rapidly they were changing, you can tell that the way that people lived their lives and interacted with each other would also change. So for instance, we went from a largely agrarian or farm-based culture to a more industrial culture. So people moved out of the countryside and into the city so that they could work. But that also changed the way that we worked and lived. We had the invention of things like cars and trains and telephones and typewriters, and that necessitated a change in the way that we communicated and the way that we went out into the world. So we went away from kind of almost tribal communities where we knew our family and our close friends to having to go out into bigger cities and meet other people and interact with those other people. It also was an age of increased regulations, so Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle, the novel that chronicled the horrible, deplorable conditions of people in the meatpacking industry and how that helped to bring about change and regulations to clean that up so that workers were not losing fingers and working horrendous long hours 7 days a week and getting paid very little for it. So along with that, you had improved living conditions, and you also had women's suffrage, which was women advocating for the right to vote, and Charlotte Perkins Gilman was a part of that movement. At the same time, you had the temperance or prohibition era where alcohol became illegal eventually, and a lot of women, especially women in Charlotte Perkins Gilman's social circles, were not necessarily advocates of drinking because they lived with spouses who might abuse that, and because the law was not necessarily on the side of women, you often had men who drank too much and who abused their families and didn't have much recourse for it. So many women at that time were against drinking because they saw the repercussions of it and they couldn't do much about it. At the time, in 1920, only about 6.5% of married white women worked outside of the home, but a lot more women who were not white did work outside of the home. So we're looking at, even though we had women fighting for the right to vote, there was still a lot of inequality happening between races and socioeconomic status. And many African American women who had been working started to migrate from the South to the North to get better pay. Some women's issues during the time period of the progressive era were that women did work inside and outside of the home. We still see this today, women working both inside and outside of the home, and kind of sometimes the inequality that ensues because of that. Marriage laws and what a woman could and could not do. Domestic violence, like I said, little recourse for if you were married to somebody who hit you. It was often viewed as the husband's right to do that because the wife was essentially treated like his property, and he was the commander of her and the household, if you will. So a divorce was very rare in those times, and if you did divorce as a woman especially, you were not looked well upon. It certainly damaged a woman's reputation. And then there was the issue of medical treatment of women. Women were not necessarily treated for issues like they are today. There were concerns with privacy and decency. So if all of the doctors are male, and if a female has a condition, a gynecological condition especially, they were often squeamish about treating women for such things. And still today there are inequities in the medical field with how women are treated because our biologies are different. And so oftentimes drug studies are done more for men than they are for women because of fear of side effects. When we're talking about medical treatments too, we're talking specifically about the rest cure, and that was a common treatment for nervous or anxious women during the time when Gilman wrote this story. And it entailed resting, so a lot of bed rest, and that didn't mean watching Netflix or scrolling through social media. It meant lying in your bed and not doing much. Maybe you were stitching, maybe you were reading, but you weren't doing much active beyond that. And some women would refuse to eat, and therefore their families would force them to eat, so force feeding them. And then some were of the belief that if you had company over, you'd get too worked up and too excited, and therefore they needed to be isolated. So you see that in the yellow wallpaper, where she is given forced bed rest, she is forced to eat certain foods to kind of fatten her up, and she is forced to spend some time alone. You have the onslaught of the types of psychology, psychoanalysis becomes more prominent, and people start to analyze what's happening in people's minds and why they do things. You have people putting smelling salts under your noses for fainting spells, and the desire to pursue a career, especially for a wealthier woman, and Gilman was one, was considered a disease. It was considered unnatural for a woman to want to work outside of the home, outside of being a wife and a mother. And sometimes if a woman tried to do that, she would be punished by her husband and society. But during this time, you did see more and more women authors starting to write, maybe write secretly, and maybe write under pen names, as Mary Shelley did with Frankenstein. And more women start to go to college, more women start to enter careers as nurses and teachers, and more women start to write for newspapers. So things did become more progressive for women, but there was still a lot of work to be done during that era. And this last slide is just a chronology of events as they pertain or relate to Gilman and her life. So Seneca Falls is the first recorded meeting of women getting together and advocating for the right to vote. Gilman's born several years after that. She lives her earliest years during the Civil War. In 1892, she publishes her work that would make her famous, the Yellow Wallpaper. And she lives through World War I. The 19th Amendment, which legalizes women's right to vote, happened shortly after that. Then you have the Depression, the Great Depression, and the stock market crash. And then in 1935, she commits suicide because she has very late stage breast cancer. So that was happening in the world. All of those things were happening in the world when Charlotte Perkins Gilman wrote The Yellow Wallpaper. And I wanted to give you a little bit of that backstory so that you could understand maybe why she wrote it and the conditions under which she wrote that story. Enjoy.